Hello, it's been a while. Yeah? I've not done a book review, I think, for the last 2.5 months. A lot has been going on, but here we are. Happy holiday season to you. I'm doing this on 26th of December, the year 2022. It's a holiday season, and I hope it's been taking you well. There could be an echo, yeah? There could be an echo in the background. Pardon me for this, but I hope you shall be able to communicate. And today's book review is one that was done by Lundy Bancroft, and it's all about why does he do that? Inside the mind of an angry and a controlling man. Why does he do that? Inside the mind of an angry and a controlling man. This book was published in 2002. The author is a consultant on domestic abuse, and he's been in this industry for more than 15 years. So this book is a collection of his experiences working as a consultant on domestic abuse. The target audience for this book is a woman, because he looks at why men abuse women and what women can do to get themselves out of that situation. So it's quite a voluminous book, yeah. It's 1,000 pages plus, yeah. Quite a big book. A good one if you love reading. Not so friendly if you don't like books. The level of difficulty is moderate. It's not a difficult book to read. And it's a good one because it has got some stories from his perspective, yeah, the real life stories that he's come across, yeah. So he begins off the book by writing the myths of abuse, yeah. First, just to let you know that Bancroft does not focus a lot on physical abuse. He says that physical abuse is direct and it's more clear. He focuses more on economic exploitation, that's financial abuse. He focuses on psychological abuse and also on emotional abuse. And he begins this book by looking at the myths. Some of the myths he says is that a man will abuse his wife or his woman because of lack of self-esteem. He says that is not true. He looks at a man will abuse a woman because of poor upbringing or because of gaps that were there in their parenting. He says that is not true. And the argument that he lays in this chapter, he says that comes from our need as a society not to hold men accountable for their actions, but always to blame women. Yeah? So he assumes that when we say that a man is abusing his woman because of poor upbringing, you're looking at the woman who raised him. So it's always you're either blaming the woman who brought him up or blaming the woman who he is living with. Yeah. So he says men do not abuse women because of upbringing. And he also argues that men do not abuse women because of drugs and substance abuse. There's actually a whole chapter that Bancroft has dedicated on alcohol and the relationship with abuse. Yeah. And he argues that alcohol is a depressant. Yeah. Actually, when you take alcohol, it depresses, it does make you aggressive. It depresses your feelings, your emotions. It can excite you, it can stimulate your emotions and your feelings, but it depresses your actions, yeah? It can impair judgment, but it doesn't make you hostile. So if you become hostile because you are drunk, it's something that you had intended. It's not because of alcohol, yeah? And then he also looks at the other myths that men become hostile when they are stressed or because of what is going on at their places of work. And he says that is a myth because at the places of work, they have done a study and they have discovered that abusive men do not change when they change jobs. It is always constant and it is always there. Then he goes to the other chapter where he looks at, the key themes in the book. Yeah? And one of the themes in the book that you're going to see is because men become abusive because of a value system, because of lack of respect for women. They do not become abusive because of environmental, and then it's not because of trigger. So now he goes to explain why therapy does not help men change their ways. This was new knowledge for me, I'll be honest. Yeah? I thought that therapy helps men to change if they are abusive. But he goes on to say that some even tend to become worse. He says that men become abusive to their women because, number one, because of lack of respect. A man will never abuse a woman when they are dating because at that time he highly admires her. At that time he needs her. He's not likely to become abusive at that time. But as time go by, getting familiar with this person, he loses respect for that lady. And when a man loses respect for a woman, he becomes abusive. He will exploit her economically because that is an indirect way of saying I don't respect you. He will emotionally abuse that person because he does not respect her. So abuse comes from a deep lack of respect. And he says if women would understand this, then they would reduce the time that they waste helping to transform a person. Because according to his argument, therapy does not teach respect. Regardless of the number of years or the number of time a person goes for counseling, he goes for therapy or whatever it is, therapy can never give someone respect. This is why he says therapy actually makes things worse. Secondly, he says therapy does not work because abuse comes from a value system. A man will abuse his woman because of what he believes. Number one, if he believes that women are to serve men, which is what comes from many cases of abuse, therapy cannot teach him otherwise. And one of the points where he says therapy does not help with abuse, he argues that actually after attending therapy sessions, maybe it's the woman or the wife who took the matters to the counselors because they wanted help. They didn't want to leave their marriage. They didn't want to leave the institution, but they needed help. It becomes worse because a man feels exposed. And when a man feels exposed, he may change temporarily to avoid losing the marriage because there are benefits, and he goes ahead to list the benefits of marriage. Why a man will abuse a woman but still stick to that relationship, he looks at the benefits that he's getting, so he will not quit, and he feels intimidated. And after they go for therapy the first time, if it is a woman who had initiated the session, he will go, but when he comes back, he will feel offended because he was exposed to the world, yeah? And he's going to revenge. He's going to do something that will make the woman know that he didn't like it. He didn't like the exposure. He also goes to say that therapy never works because abusers don't admit they're abusers. It is unlikely that an abuser will admit they are abusing you. So he says some of the excuses he hears are like, no, I didn't abuse her. She triggered me, yeah? So he will always argue that there's something the woman is doing to trigger him, yeah? So he gives a lot of examples, especially with sexual abuse. And he says when sexual abuse happens, many abusers tend to defend and say, her body is mine, we are one, we can always have sex if we are married, we can always have sex if we are together, we cannot go for this long. So they never admit that they are abusing someone, and that is why they never change even when they're taken for therapy, because they can promise to change so that they win the woman back, so that they continue getting the benefits of marriage, but they never change, yeah? So the next chapter that the author is looking at how to identify if one is in an abusive relationship, and it's like gives like what I could call a score sheet, yeah? He looks at how fast that person took the relationship. He says one thing that is constant with abusers is they rush things. They never allow a relationship to take its normal course or the normal dynamics. He mentioned the element of being silenced in conversations. If someone is always silencing you in a conversation and always want his ideas to be the best and to shine, that's an abuser. He'll abuse you one day. He looks at how he relates with his exes and the words he uses to describe the people he's dated before. If he's quite disrespectful, that's an abuser. And he also looks at his opinion and how he relates with women. If this person is always talking bad about women, have very negative perspectives about women, that person is most likely an abuser, and it will not change because you are also another woman and you are going to bear the brunt of it all. And then he also mentions how the person treats you, both in public and in private. And then he says if someone treats you differently in public, yeah, like he's so cold when you're together, but when you go out, he's so praising you. Or he treats you well and is praising you when you're together, but when you go out in public, he's quite cold. You could be going through abuse and you could be dealing with an abuser. Then the other chapter that he dedicates, it's looking at why men abuse women, yeah? And he definitely goes back to what he had said at the beginning of the book. It's a value system. And he looks at where these value systems come from, yeah? So he looks at a young boy growing up. What are the things that he's taught? And in that value system, he looks at what does he believe, because there's a difference between being taught and adopting something, yeah? He looks at when boys see their fathers become lords over their mothers, they bite. And when they bite and believe that is a value system, they will be lord over somebody sometime, and that is abuse. He looks at religion and the teachings of religion, and he says why the deeply religious men tend to be very abusive. And it's because in the Bible or in the Holy Book, there are teachings that say that a man should be submissive to a man. So, sorry, a woman should be submissive to a man. That verse in its own gives the men power to control women. Power to control is now extrapolated to abuse. And so he goes deeply to show how when he was working in a camp, why most of the women who are going through abuse were those married to deeply religious men, and why that concept or that belief system shaped or set the ground for abuse for these women. Then he also looks at all our culture, how our culture dictates that women are to be subservient to men. And then because he's an American author, he looks at different cultures. He looks at the Caucasians, he looks at the Africans, the Asians, and what it means for them in these setups, yeah? Then he goes again to look at respect, which we had mentioned before, how men lose respect for women. And when a man loses respect for his wife, he's going to abuse her psychologically, he's going to exploit her economically, because that's the only way he can communicate that I don't respect you. Then there is now the other chapter that he dedicates to look at how abuse affects families. And first he looks at the parenting and the kids, and then he looks at the woman. And if we can start with the woman, he mentioned several things how a woman is affected, but says that the first thing that a woman loses is trust in herself. A woman learns never to trust her ideas. She learns to doubt herself, and it is unlikely that she's going to do anything meaningful or significant with her life in the period that she'll be in that abusive relationship. So if she's going to be married to that person for life, it is unlikely that she'll do big and great things with herself, because she's always doubting herself. Because when a woman tries to put her foot down, maybe trying to stop the abuse, maybe the man will always change the story. And as we said, abusers don't admit their faults, and they also don't admit that they're abusive. So when they change the story, the woman now learns how to doubt herself. And when she doubts herself, she can never trust herself, and she will live miserable, simply because she doesn't believe in herself and she's doubting herself too much. He also goes to look at the cases of anxiety and depression. He says because of learned helplessness, or acquired helplessness, many have overcome the depression states, but many tend to live with anxiety. And that anxiety manifests in their bodies, it manifests with fear, it manifests in so many other ways. Then he looks at how abuse affects children, and first is that children learn not to respect their mother. They may love their mother, but some don't love her. but they don't learn to respect her. So some feel like now they have acquired the same powers with their dad and they can trample over their mother, so they don't respect her authority. Yeah? So a woman is likely to lose the influence that she has over her kids because she loses the authority because of this abuse. Looks at the way kids now learn that love comes through abuse, and they're likely to replicate it in their own lives because the love language is abuse. And it also says that someone who is abusing the spouse is also likely to be abusing the children, and they tend to think it is acceptable. And they think it is acceptable because if mom is accepting abuse, then they also feel they can also accept abuse. Then now the other chapter looks at how, as a society, you can help someone who is going through abuse. Looks at why it is not always good to tell them to leave, that they should be allowed to leave at their own time. They can be encouraged to leave, they can be supported to leave, but they will always leave at their own times. Yeah. So he also looks at how to help them trust themselves, how to not interfere with them when they are talking, how to listen to them because definitely they are not used to being listened to at home, and how to know that you can always offer a shoulder to lean on. Then he looks at therapy, and he says, number one, that if a couple is to seek therapy for abuse, there has to be a separation first. A man will never change his ways of abuse if he's still living with a woman. And he says the first time the woman should step out as a separation, he says it's not a mandatory that she divorce if she's not willing to divorce. But they should separate. Then the man works on himself when the woman is away. And then if she comes back and there is no change, they should know that that is not going to work. And if she comes back it turns worse, as earlier mentioned, most of the times it becomes worse if the man did not volunteer to go for the therapy. Then the author also says that most of the times therapy that is associated with domestic abuse takes over 2 years period. He says it's unlikely that a man is going to recover or become better with just a short term, like 1 session or 2 sessions. It says they need at least 2 years, that is over 24 months, with more than 3 sessions of interactions every month. That's the only way they are able to change. He says that even for therapy, a man and a woman should never go for therapy together, especially when dealing with abuse. The man should go alone and the woman should go alone. They should never work together because according to his experience, it never works out well. It's a good book. As I had told you earlier, it's quite voluminous. It's more than 1,000 pages. Needs a lot of patience. It's a deep book, deep book. I recommend that every woman should read this book because you are surrounded by people who are going through abuse, and sometimes we don't support them well. Like there's a chapter where he's talking about how we support abuse as a society. Yeah? And if you're telling a woman to stay for the sake of the kids, you're supporting and advocating for abuse. If you're telling a woman not to separate her kids from an abusive man because kids need a father, I actually felt challenged because I'm one person who's always been advocating for kids to have access to their father. And there was, I never used to understand the circumstances through which a woman can separate a kid from her dad. Yeah? But then he's talking about abuse and how kids who have grown up in abusive relationships and the mother has separated, how the mother needs to protect them from such abuse. Yeah? So it's a good book. I encourage you to read so that you know how to support the women in your life who are going through abuse. There's a chapter that is dedicated to how women can get safe and how to live an abusive relationship, because he says living an abusive relationship is quite hard because abusive men never allow themselves to be left. Yeah. So he gives advice on how to live. And if you are reading this book, even if you're a man, you're surrounded by sisters, you're surrounded by friends, you will know what to tell them if they need to leave an abusive man. Yani mwenye kuacha imekuwa ngumu, yeah? And then it's a good book. I recommend. It's quite voluminous. If you don't like reading books, you may not be able to touch this one, yeah? But it's a good one. I encourage you to read it, and Please just let me know what you think about the review, and also let me know what you think about the book, and Happy New Year!